There's someone knocking in front of my house.
The man is saying that it was his father.
Pushing to 28 years at this police department, we never had anything like this happen before.
On January 7th, 2023, in the quiet residential neighborhood of High Point, North Carolina, 45-year-old Hollywood actor Robert Crayton Jr. shot and killed his wife, 46-year-old Ophelia, along with 3 of their children, 18-year-old Kasim, 16-year-old Nyla, and 10-year-old Nasir. Police had been to that house more than once before the tragedy, but nothing was ever done to stop what eventually happened. Behind the facade of a stable, comfortable family was something neighbors, friends, and co-workers could only guess at.
While the community tries to heal and wrap its head around what could lead a person to kill their family, High Point Police is continuing to investigate.
Stick with this video to the end to understand what pushed a man to this kind of unthinkable violence against his own family, and how that tragic day ended for him personally. Robert Jeffrey Crayton Jr. was born in Brooklyn, New York. A big, powerfully built man standing 6'3", he'd been drawn to acting since he was young. He landed his first notable role in 2010 on TRU-TV, a starting point in a career he stayed in for more than a decade after that. Over time, his resume grew to include a role in Marvel Studios' Ant-Man, HBO's Ballers, NBC's Young Rock, and Disney's Safety. The list of roles was short but recognizable, enough that his face turned up on screens for millions of viewers who had no idea what was happening away from set.
I basically think that Shifting Gears is probably a story about a family that's trying hard to keep something that they love.
In High Point, where the family eventually settled, people knew Robert as something else entirely. Not an actor with a handful of credits, but a regular at the YMCA basketball courts on Hartley Drive. There, people just called him RC or Rob. To his neighbors, he wasn't a face from the screen. He was the guy from down the street who showed up to play pickup basketball in the evenings. Someone from their own circle, not someone from a set. Ophelia Athena Crayton was born into a family with Jamaican roots. Her relatives came from Kingston, the Jamaican capital. She spent her childhood and teenage years in Miami and South Carolina, and once she came of age, made a decision that shaped the rest of her path. She enlisted in the United States Army. She served as a sergeant in the 2nd Infantry Division, where her specialty was heavy equipment, a role that demands technical training and discipline, rarely the image people later associated with her among family and neighbors. After the Army, Ophelia settled with her family in High Point and neighboring Jamestown. There, she built a life that held several roles at once. She became a small business owner, earned her certification as a North Carolina notary, completed training and earned a life coach certification, and also picked up a certificate in interior design. Alongside all of that, she kept studying, pursuing a psychology degree at North Carolina A and T State University. Relatives, remembering her later, kept coming back to the same words. She was the glue of the family and everyone's best friend. The eldest of the children, Kasim Amaru Crayton, was born September 29, 2004. He attended Ragsdale High School and, together with a business partner, launched his own clothing brand called Only Chase Money Apparel. People who knew him described him as someone with a positive outlook, a sharp mind, and a recognizable, distinctive style. Not just a teenager, but already a person forming his own ambitions. Nyla Athena Joyce Crayton, 16, also attended Ragsdale High School. Classmates described her as someone with a genuine and beautiful soul, the rare kind of person who, in the words of people around her, lit up a room with her beauty the moment she walked in. That description spoke less to how she looked and more to how the people closest to her actually experienced her as someone warm and real. The youngest, 10-year-old Nasir, attended Union Hill Elementary School. Less is known about his childhood than about his older brother and sister. Unlike them, he hadn't yet had the time to build up the circle of stories and characterizations that get left behind after a person is gone. He was still at the age where life was only just beginning to unfold. The combination of pursuits Ophelia juggled says something on its own about who she was. Notary, life coach, interior designer, psychology student, all at once, on top of raising kids and running her own business. People who build that kind of well-rounded background rarely settle for what they've already achieved. To her family and friends, Ophelia stayed someone constantly looking for a way to be useful, not just to herself, but to everyone around her. That's why the description, glue of the family, coming from relatives, wasn't some throwaway phrase. It was an accurate description of her role. the person holding together what might otherwise have come apart. The house on Mossy Meadow Drive, where the family ultimately settled, sat in a residential neighborhood of High Point, a city the Craytons split their final years between, along with neighboring Jamestown. To the people around them, their house looked like dozens of others nearby, an ordinary American family with kids of different ages. Nothing about that everyday rhythm gave away what was actually being logged in police records.
High Point police say they were called to the family's home 5 times since 2014, both for domestic and medical related incidents.
On the surface, the Crayton family gave the impression of a stable household, but behind that facade, starting in 2014, police were called to the house on Mossy Meadow Drive 5 separate times, and each of those calls left its own mark in the official record long before the rest of the state ever heard of this family. On January 30th, 2014, a report came in about a beating. Police arrived on scene, but found no evidence sufficient for an arrest. The incident stayed in the files as an unresolved episode, no charges, no consequences, no answer to what had actually happened inside that house that day. On December 30th, 2016, there was another call, this time classified as a domestic disturbance, a conflict between family members. And once again, the case went nowhere in the official record. On December 2nd, 2019, another report came in, a conflict between 2 people. Officers who responded found no signs of violence. The incident was formally closed the same way the earlier ones had been. No arrest, no charges, no public findings. Then came January 2022, a stretch that, looking back today, stands out sharply from everything else. On January 2nd, a medical call came in. And the very next day, January 3rd, police showed up at the house on Mossy Meadow Drive for a different reason entirely, to carry out an order for the involuntary psychiatric commitment of Robert Crayton. According to Lieutenant Patrick Welsh, it was the family itself who initiated that step, meaning the people closest to Robert considered the situation serious enough to request forced intervention. Later, after the tragedy, the Greensboro News and Record, citing sources close to the family, reported that Robert Crayton's diagnosis was bipolar disorder.
The only information that we have up to this point is that he was suffering with some mental illness.
Police officially confirmed only that he had some kind of mental illness, without naming the specific diagnosis publicly. Where exactly Robert was sent after his commitment, how long he stayed under medical observation, and whether any follow-up treatment was prescribed after his release, all of that stayed outside what open sources have ever documented. It's worth pausing here to ask a question this story still doesn't directly answer. What was happening inside this family in the stretch between the involuntary commitment in early 2022 and the tragedy in early 2023? Nearly a year passed. Did that intervention actually work? Or did the problem it was meant to address keep building, hidden from outside view? Part of an answer, even if only indirect, comes from someone who knew Robert from a completely different side of his life. Victor Joyner, who worked at the Maltsby Talent Agency and had stayed in touch with Robert for years through the acting world, recalled their last conversation shortly before Thanksgiving 2022, meaning after the commitment had already happened. According to Joyner, Robert talked at the time about spending time with his wife, whom, in his words, he loved very much.
What I like a lot about Derwin, and I like the fact that he's a guy that even when probably chips is bad.
Joyner described him as someone you could turn to in a hard moment and get solid advice, and added that when Robert was away filming, he missed his family, and during phone calls would sometimes cut things short just to go spend time with his kids. That description, warm, almost idyllic, sits uneasily next to the picture of a house police visited 5 times in 9 years, and an order for involuntary commitment initiated by the family itself a year before the tragedy. You could argue that the people around him only ever saw the version of Robert he chose to show the world, while something else entirely was unfolding inside the house on Mossy Meadow Drive, hidden even from close friends. Or you could argue the opposite, that the man Joyner described really was sincere in his attachment to his family, and that the tragedy wasn't the result of years of hidden conflict, but a sudden, catastrophic breakdown triggered by the illness itself. These remain only theories. The investigation never gave a definitive answer either way. Another question stays open too. Why, after 5 police calls and 1 involuntary commitment, did the family keep living in that same house, in the same familiar rhythm, with no publicly known additional safety measures? This story doesn't offer an answer to that, any more than it answers what was actually happening in that house in the final weeks and days before January 7th. Before we go any further, if this story has you hooked, hit like. It tells us stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case we dig into. And drop a comment. What do you think really happened here? Now, back to the story. January 7th, 2023, fell on a Saturday, the kind of morning when most houses on Mossy Meadow Drive were still asleep, and the street was only just beginning to stir. At around 7 in the morning, the neighborhood's quiet was broken by screaming and gunshots coming from the Crayton house. Neighbors, used to an ordinary Saturday hush, heard something unmistakable, and almost immediately afterward, 2 adults came running out of the house in what neighbors would later describe as sheer panic.
Turned into a crime scene Saturday morning.
There's someone knocking up in front of my house saying someone tried to kill them.
Chilling 911
These were the 2 survivors, a 25-year-old man and a 22-year-old woman.
escaped the home.
The man is saying that it was his father. He said he's sure that he still has the gun.
Officers arrived shortly.
According to the outlet truecrimesocietyblog.com, the man was a direct relative of the family, an older adult child of Athalia and Robert, and the woman was his partner. Both, having broken free of the house, ran toward the neighboring homes, pounding on doors, ringing doorbells, screaming that they urgently needed help. One neighbor, who didn't give their name to the press, later relayed to reporters what they'd heard from the surviving man in those first, most chaotic minutes after it happened. According to that account, the young man described waking up to find a gun already pressed to his head, held by his father. Somehow, he managed to pull the magazine out of the gun, and that gave him and his partner the chance to break out of the room and run from the house. That detail, a magazine pulled from a gun in the fraction of a second separating life from death, remains, as of today, the only known account of what was happening inside that house in the moments right before neighbors heard the gunshots. No other testimony about how events unfolded inside the house appears in open sources. Not the exact order in which the other family members were hurt, not how much time passed between the first shot and the last. At 7:05 a.m., High Point Police Dispatch took a call. 2 people were reported on the street, screaming for help. Patrol cars were sent to Mossy Meadow Drive immediately. Arriving on scene, police officers found the house locked, with no sound coming from inside that might suggest anyone alive was in a position to open the door. To get in, officers had to force the door open, a standard procedure in situations where there's reason to believe a threat to life may be on the other side of a closed door. What officers found inside was later described by Captain Matt Truitt, an officer with more than 18 years in law enforcement, as a scene with no equal in scale over his entire career in the city of High Point.
27, pushing to 28 years at this police department, we never had anything like this happen before.
Inside the house were 5 people dead. Athalia Crayton, her children, Kasim, Nyla, and Nasir, and Robert Crayton Jr. himself. All 5 were pronounced dead on the spot, with no opportunity for any kind of medical intervention. According to the outlet charlottealertsnews.com, Robert Crayton took his own life with a gunshot to the head before police arrived on the scene, meaning within those same minutes that separated the moment the 2 survivors ran from the house and the moment patrol cars pulled up and forced the door open. That detail means the man responsible for the deaths of 4 members of his own family ended his own life within minutes of what he'd done, without waiting for police to arrive or making any attempt to explain himself or flee. High Point Police never publicly disclosed the type of weapon Robert Crayton used. Investigators at the time were pursuing a separate line of inquiry, establishing whether the weapon had been legally purchased, whether it was registered to Robert Crayton, and how it ended up in his possession that Saturday morning. As of today, open sources still don't have answers to any of those questions. The house at 2734 Mossy Meadow Drive looked that morning no different on the outside from the neighboring houses on that quiet High Point street. Neither the evening before nor early that Saturday morning did any neighbor report anything unusual happening in the house. No raised voices, no sounds of an argument, nothing that might have warned of what was about to happen in the span of a few minutes after 7 o'clock. Between the moment neighbors first heard screaming and gunshots and the moment the 2 survivors appeared on the street, only seconds passed, at least based on the available accounts. The neighbors that the surviving man and his partner ran to became the first people to learn what had happened, and it was their immediate response, banging on doors, ringing bells, that got word of the tragedy to emergency services as fast as it possibly could have traveled in a situation like that. The exact order in which Athalia, Kasim, Nyla, and Nasir died was never officially disclosed. The little that's known for certain is the surviving son's account of a gun pressed to his own head, and the seconds in which he managed to pull the magazine from the weapon. That episode remains the only window into what was happening inside the house, and it leaves open the question of what was happening in the other rooms during those same minutes, while the two young people fought for their own lives. For a family with at least one documented instance of involuntary psychiatric commitment in its past, the question of how a weapon that dangerous ended up freely accessible inside the house takes on particular weight, and it remains without an official answer. High Point Police Chief Travis Stroud, commenting on what his officers saw that morning, said that in 27, almost 28 years with the department, nothing like this had ever happened before. According to him, the department had to arrange psychological support for the officers who were on scene. That's how difficult the scene inside the house was. In one comment, Stroud summed up what happened in the fewest possible words. It was a very heavy crime scene. While officers worked inside the house, a crowd began gathering outside on Mossy Meadow Drive, neighbors woken by the screaming and gunfire, then alarmed by the sight of patrol cars and crime scene tape, stepping outside to try to understand what was happening just a few feet from their own front doors. For a neighborhood where, by all appearances, nothing like this had ever happened before, that morning became the moment the usual Saturday quiet gave way to a scene that would stay with everyone nearby for a long time. The scene itself was cordoned off, and the work there took hours, identifying each of the 5 deceased, documenting the position of the bodies, searching for and collecting possible evidence, including the weapon the shots were fired from. All of it standard procedure for a crime scene of this scale. There was never going to be a criminal trial in this case, and there never could have been. Robert Crayton Jr. died at the scene of the crime within minutes of what he'd done.
Shot his wife and 3 children, then turned the gun on himself. Tonight we're learning more about the moments after they died.
High Point Police officially classified the case as a murder-suicide, a category that, by definition, closes off any path to a trial, a verdict, or a publicly announced sentence. Even so, it's worth pausing for a moment on the question that inevitably comes up with cases like this. What would have awaited Robert Crayton had he survived and stood trial in the state of North Carolina? This is nothing more than a reconstruction, based on the scale of what he did, not on any actual court ruling, because none ever existed. The killing of 4 people, 3 of them children, including a 10-year-old, falls squarely into the kind of aggravating circumstances state courts treat as grounds for the maximum penalty available under the law for first-degree murder. In cases like this, where the victims are a defendant's own minor children, courts are rarely lenient. Working through the hypothetical outcome, it's reasonable to assume the result would have been life in prison without the possibility of parole, or, under certain circumstances, the maximum penalty North Carolina law formally allows. But that remains a supposition, not a fact. Neither the prosecution, nor the defense, nor a jury ever got the chance to actually consider this case. The only thing that genuinely continued after Robert Crayton's death was the ongoing work of the investigation, focused not on the question of guilt, but on the question of why. And here, a statement from Lieutenant Patrick Welsh at a press conference marked the outer limit of what police were even willing to say about this case. He stressed that establishing a motive would be part of the investigation, but immediately added that he'd already warned the family themselves. There was a real chance the reason behind what happened would never be established. In his words, what goes on in the heart and mind of a person capable of something like this sometimes dies with them. Just as tightly sealed is the question of the details surrounding the involuntary psychiatric commitment Robert Crayton underwent on January 3rd, 2022. What kind of treatment he received, how long he stayed under medical observation, and whether any follow-up therapy was prescribed after his release. Police provided no official answers to any of these questions, either in the days after the tragedy or since. Formally, that falls outside the scope of a criminal investigation. With no defendant and none ever coming, investigators have no procedural need to disclose a dead man's medical history. But it's precisely because of that closed door that the public never got an answer to perhaps the most practical question in this entire story. Was that intervention a year earlier effective in any real way? Or did the system, having responded once to the family's call for help, simply lose track of the situation after that? On January 28, 2023, a little over 3 weeks after the tragedy, family and loved ones said goodbye to Atalia, Kasim, Nyla, and Nasir Crayton. The service was held at the Alumni Foundation Event Center at 200 North Benbow Road in Greensboro, North Carolina. Public visitation was set for 10:30 to 11:55 a.m., with the funeral service itself beginning at exactly noon. Arrangements were handled by Bostic Tompkins Funeral Home. The fact that 4 members of the same family were buried together in a single ceremony speaks on its own to the scale of loss their loved ones had to face, saying goodbye to a mother and 3 children, not across separate days and separate rooms, but together, in one space, at 1 hour. Guilford County Schools released an official statement announcing the loss of 2 Ragsdale High School students, Kasim and Nyla, and 1 Union Hill Elementary School student, Nasir. In its statement, the district described what happened as an event that left the school community devastated and said the thoughts of district staff were with the family of the deceased. A family relative named Tar Thompson took the initiative and created a memorial page on Facebook where he posted photos of the victims. Alongside that, he felt it necessary to warn followers about fraudulent fundraisers that had started appearing under the guise of charity campaigns on GoFundMe, a practice that, unfortunately, tends to follow high-profile tragedies that draw wide public attention. In his post, Thompson wrote that he loved them, for who they were, for the quality of their character, and for the pure, golden core of their hearts. He added that the grief the family was going through was unbearable, and that their hearts were broken by what happened to their loved ones. Ophelia's family released an extended official statement describing her and her 3 children as a light to everyone they crossed paths with. The statement said their lives were taken far too soon, but that the legacy they left behind lives on, from the shores of Jamaica, where Ophelia's family came from, to the campus of NCA&T, where she was a student at the time of her death. In separate public comments, relatives described Ophelia as a mother willing to go through anything for her children's well-being, and her brother called her an incredible woman and best friend to everyone who knew her. The case drew wide coverage, both locally and nationally, across American media. Among the outlets that covered the tragedy, NBC News, People Magazine, The Daily Mail, the platform Oxygen, and local TV stations Fox 8, WXII, and WFMY News 2. That level of attention came down to a combination of several factors. First, the scale of the tragedy itself. 5 victims in a single house, including children ages 10 and 16, is rare enough on its own to draw major newsroom attention. Second, Robert Crayton's own identity. Having an IMDb page listing roles in Marvel, NBC, and Disney projects gave the story extra pull for outlets that typically cover the lives of public figures. Third, in terms of timing, this tragedy landed close to another, similar event. 3 days earlier, a mass killing of family members in Utah had left 8 people dead, and that coincidence gave both stories a shared media context, one that fed into a broader conversation about what was happening across the country. A separate space of remembrance for the victims took shape on the platform gunmemorial.org, which specializes in creating memorial pages for victims of gun violence. On that platform, a separate page was created for each of the victims, Nyla, Qasim, Nasir, and Athalia, and across all 4 pages combined, users lit more than 4,000 virtual candles. People who knew Nyla, leaving comments on her page, kept coming back to the same thing: a kind and genuine heart, someone who always put the people close to her first. A description that, for a 16-year-old, says a great deal. The major outlets' interest in Robert Crayton's identity had a flip side. A significant share of the coverage, particularly in entertainment-focused publications, built headlines around the fact that the killer was an actor with roles in projects from major studios, a framing that inadvertently shifted the focus away from the 4 murdered family members and onto the one person responsible for their deaths. For the victims' relatives, that kind of emphasis became an additional source of pain. Their loved ones risked being remembered in the public mind primarily as relatives of a celebrity, rather than as people with their own lives and stories. There was also a response from people who knew Robert Crayton through acting, the side of his life that never intersected with what happened on Mossy Meadow Drive. Coco Hillary, who worked with Robert on a project back in 2019, told the press that the pandemic had affected everyone differently and that mental health remained a serious issue, a restrained statement, but a telling one in its own way. Even his colleagues from the acting world, when asked to comment, chose to talk not about guilt or motive, but specifically about the mental state of a man they'd known. Robert Crayton, whose guilt in the murder of his own wife and 3 children was formally never established by a court, since no court ever took up the case, remains a man whose motives the world will, in all likelihood, never learn. He died the same Saturday morning as his family, and with him went the only source who could have explained what happened in his mind between the year of his involuntary commitment and the morning of January 7th. This story doesn't give its audience a comforting ending. No explained motive, no trial, no final answer to what was actually happening inside the house on Mossy Meadow Drive in the months before the tragedy. What's left is a record of 5 police calls over 9 years, 1 episode of involuntary commitment, a wealth of warm memories from people who knew the family from completely different corners of their lives, and the silence of the one person who could have tied all these fragments into a single, coherent picture. All 4 of them, Atelia and her children, did nothing to deserve that morning of January 7th. And if this family's story leaves behind anything bigger than a chronicle of one of the worst tragedies in High Point's history, it's a question that reaches far beyond one house on Mossy Meadow Drive. Can mental illness, left without proper oversight, become a ticking time bomb inside any family? Even one that looks, from the outside, like it has everything going for it.